We're back on the record at 1:28 p.m.
Okay. Returning to the topic of progressive discipline, I want to understand. Oh. Returning to the topic of progressive discipline, your understanding of what's the initial action that would be taken against a pilot would be what?
I wouldn't call it initial action against a pilot. If you're talking about the first level of discipline, the first level of discipline is actually a letter of warning. However, certainly there is administrative counseling that takes place, as well as even up to a letter of counsel before we get to a letter of warning. However, a letter of counsel is not considered discipline.
Okay. And then after a letter of warning, what would be the next step up in the hierarchy?
Well, then you would go to, you would have days off that are in conjunction with the letter of warning, up to a final letter of warning, and then termination.
I'm directing your attention to a document that's date stamp DA 292 to 294, and I'm going to direct your attention within to page 293. Under the second heading, it indicates from Jim Graham to O.C. Miller, subject Ray, Carleen Petitt, and is that an email that you sent to O.C. Miller on or about November 9th, 2015?
Yes, it is.
Okay, and then directly below that, there's a heading from Miller OC to Jim Graham. Is that an email that you received from Jim Graham from there to the end of the page on November 9th, 2015?
Just to the bottom of 293.
Correct.
Yes, I believe that's correct.
And it references the fact that Ms. Petitt attended the IAAS the, Safety Summit in Miami on November 2nd. And what's your understanding of what the IAAS Safety Summit was?
I actually don't recall what that stands for.
It has something to do with aviation?
I would be guessing if I told you yes.
Okay. And there's a reference right after that where RA was speaking. Would you agree with me that's RA is a reference to Richard Anderson, the then CEO of Delta Airlines?
I believe that's what he meant, yes.
Okay. And he says here, I'm concerned that she taped his speech. Also want you to be aware she's requesting that Phil arrange a meeting for her with you and Steve. I will discuss with Phil later today. What did you understand his concern about taping of his speech to refer to?
I don't have any clue.
Okay. And would there, if it referenced that she had taped Richard Anderson's speech at a safety conference. Would there be anything in violation of Delta policy with respect to that action?
Not that I'm aware of.
Okay. Now, this email that you took some time to review reflects that November 9th, 2015, you were considering a potential referral of Ms. Petitt for a Section 15 review, correct?
Actually, what I was trying to do was to ensure that we understood what her actions were and why she could or could not understand what might be appropriate in the administrative workplace. And if she couldn't do that, it brought into question whether or not she would be able to appropriately execute her duties as a flight crew member. So therefore, we may need to consider a Section 15. Yes.
Okay, well, yeah, it says here, if I'm reading incorrectly, let me know. It says in the last paragraph, I also think we should consider whether a Section 15 is appropriate. Now, why were you considering a Section 15 on November 9th, 2015?
Objection asked and answered.
If you're not directed to answer, I'd ask you to answer that question. Why specifically were you considering a Section 15 referral on November 9th, 2015?
Objection to the form as well.
I actually state we should consider whether Section 15 is appropriate, and I think that my sentence stands, and I still believe that to this day. It stands to reason she might not be able to make appropriate decisions for the safe operation of a flight as a crew member.
What prompted you to believe that at this time?
Because of the counseling that she had been given prior to this point about social media and her involvement in various public forums.
Okay, but she had never been disciplined with respect to social media, correct?
No.
And she had never been disciplined with respect to her involvement in other activities.
Well, you're making it sound like Section 15 is disciplinary or punitive in any way, and it's not.
I'm asking you just to answer.
It's important the witness be allowed to finish his.
Yeah, it's also important that the witness answer the questions that are posed. I'm asking, was she ever disciplined with respect to her involvement in any activities?
That's not what you said. I could have him read it back if you'd like to, but my point here is that you're trying to lead to the point that Section 15 is some sort of punitive or action that is administratively disciplined, and it absolutely is not.
I'm going to ask you to listen very carefully to my question and try to answer my question if you can. Has Ms. Petitt ever been disciplined by Delta Airlines?
No.
Why did you consider it appropriate at this time to contemplate a Section 15 referral as contrasted with giving her a written warning?
Objection again to the form.
If you think that someone understands and violates intentionally, then you would go down the path of discipline. If you didn't think that they were doing it intentionally because they were just designed or intentionally violating the policy, then you would have to come to the conclusion that there may be other issues out there. And that's what led me to think that a Section 15 may be the most appropriate action.
How many times did Ms. Petitt violate Delta's social media policy?
I don't recall.
And you referred to, I think, involvement in other activities. How many times did her involvement in other activities violate Delta policy?
Well, I'm not sure that there's a that I would specifically talk about it as a violation of Delta policy as much as I would say after being given direction on the guidelines to ensure that Delta was brought into the loop for various things that she was participating in, she did not follow those guidelines. And while I don't know the exact number, nor would I have the ability to get that information anywhere that I can recall, I do know that there was I was made aware of I believe it was an interview in Dallas. There was a book that was written that she asked for permission to put a Delta aircraft on her book and identify herself as a Delta pilot. There were a couple of speaking engagements that, or events that she was attended as in her uniform without prior notification or knowledge of Delta. Those were the ones that relayed to me.
Prior to you say the book, the speaking engagements, and what else?
And the what I was told was an interview possibly with someone in Dallas.
You say she asked for permission with respect to the publication of her book, correct?
No, she didn't ask for permission. She asked for permission to use a Delta aircraft on the cover of her book.
And was that permission granted?
No.
And did she then proceed to violate that directive?
No.
She complied with the directive?
She did.
Okay. And then there was a speaking engagement. What speaking engagement?
I don't have any notes in front of me. I can't give you exact on that. You would have to talk to either Captain Davis or Captain Miller to get specifics.
And how many speaking engagements?
I told you I don't have a number.
But you have some specific recollection that she violated a Delta policy with respect to one or more speaking engagements?
That she represented herself as a Delta pilot at the speaking engagements without prior permission.
And was she, well, you've already said she's never been disciplined. Was she given some, was there a formal Delta response?
To my understanding, there was a counseling session about that.
And after
more than one.
After that counseling session, were there further Delta violations, Petitt violations of Delta's policy with respect to speaking engagements?
I believe there were.
Okay. Can you identify those?
I can't.
And if there were subsequent violations, can you explain why she was not given a warning letter?
Well, once again, we don't jump directly to discipline. We never have at Delta. And the tie goes to the runner for the pilot. So if we feel like we're making progress with understanding, then we're going to continue down that road. I think eventually she was given a letter of counsel. However, that's not discipline. But what we did need to do was to document the fact that she had been given counseling, and that really is the next form. So, as things progress, you want to move from counseling to a formal letter of counsel that outlines everything that you talked about in the counseling session, and also create the appropriate record of the issues.
For what did she receive a letter of counseling?
I would have to go back and take a look. I can't remember.
Do you recall whether the transgression for which she was given the letter of counseling was ever repeated?
I don't recall.
I've handed you a document which has been identified as Graham Exhibit 11. It's bait stamp Delta 19051, 19053. And the first email exchange is from Stephen Dixon to Jim Graham, just one line. "Oh, brother, just touched down at CDG. Have a good night, Jim." Is that an email that you got from Steve Dixon on or about November 16th, 2015?
Yes, it is.
Okay. And then you had written to him, she's talking about OC, doesn't even know his title.
Correct.
Okay, and then after, below that, I'm really confused which senior VP is harassing her. That was a email from Mr. Dixon to you on November 16th.
That's correct.
Okay, and then below, you wrote this email to Steve Dixon. "Here we go, just FYI, I will brief HR and handle this with kid gloves. She could be a candidate for Section 15 after this goes through. She continues to see herself as the victim and refuses to accept that she cannot just use Delta proprietary information as her own, as well as Delta pictures, aircraft, QRH, Volume 1, etc., and intellectual knowledge will keep you informed, JG." Now, you wrote that to Mr. Dixon on November 16th, 2015?
Yes, I did.
Okay. And who did you brief at HR?
I actually don't recall that I briefed HR at this time.
Well, why would you have said that to Steve Dixon, that you were going to brief HR?
That's a good question. I can't. I can't comment other than to say that if we have a situation that we do believe could be a if you don't mind, I'll look at the second page because it helps refresh my memory on exactly what went into this.
Okay. Well, Ms. Petitt was writing to you about safety culture issues, correct?
Correct. But you've given me a single paragraph to come back and say, why would I have done that? And if you would like me not to look at the document, that's fine. But if it's in front of me, I do believe that I should be allowed to go ahead and look at the rest of the context.
Let me ask you a narrower question.
So is the question withdrawn? Because there's a
Yeah, the
question
question's withdrawn.
saying you're
The
refusing
question-
to let the witness look at the
The
document. in
question
order
is
to answer the
withdrawn.
question?
Question's withdrawn. When you say, "Here we go, just FYI, I will brief HR and handle this with kid gloves," do you know what this refers to?
Not without referencing the rest of the
Okay,
document.
so go ahead and reference the document.
Okay. Yes, this was in response to her notifying me that she felt that she had been harassed by a senior VP. If we're stepping into a harassment case, then I would have immediately contacted HR. And when I say handle this with kid gloves, obviously this is not something we would be handling internal to Delta at that point. So, I mean, internal to flight operations, let me correct that. We typically hand these off to the HR team to do the investigation and to understand more about it.
And when you, in the second sentence, say she could be a candidate for a Section 15 after this goes through.
After we review her complaint
Okay.
for harassment.
Okay. And what did her complaint concern?
Well, I believe that her complaint was with respect to how she was being, how she alleged she was being treated by what she quoted as a senior VP, but actually was the managing director of flying operations, and in this context would have been her regional director and chief pilot.
Now, if you can go back to Graham Exhibit 8. Now that this first this first email, this first paragraph, you agree you wrote this paragraph, correct?
Yes.
Okay, and it says, after conferring with Mike, Brendan, and Meg, we have decided to give Carleen Petitt her requested audience the morning of December 1. Let me pause there. Mike is who? What's his full name?
I believe that was Mike Cashel, who was running, who was general manager of HR for flight operations at the time.
Okay, and who's Brendan?
Brendan Brandon is was the managing director of labor relations.
Okay, and Meg?
Meg Taylor is a attorney with our legal department.
And it goes on to say, I will ensure Steve is referring to whom?
Steve Dixon.
Is briefed up that we do not see any harassment substantiation in her correspondence, so we find no basis to start an investigation into her singular claim. So at any time prior to January 28th, did the company investigate any harassment issue that had been raised?
There was no substance that we could see in the correspondence that she sent to me that would give me enough to go on to start into an investigation at that time.
I really wasn't asking you about your rationale. I'm asking, at any time prior to January 28th, did you investigate any issue of harassment that related to Ms. Petitt?
Objection to the form. You, meaning this person, or you mean Delta?
Did you understand my question?
I'll respond with that I believe that you meant Delta Airlines, and that as far as the official investigation into the harassment claims, they were not started until we received her report.
Okay. So, and you received a report January 28th, 2016.
Correct.
You said, the next sentence reads, we also do not find any identified safety threat to the company or the operation, only your assertion there is a safety culture concern. So did I read that correctly?
Yes, you did.
If there had been a specific safety threat, would you have declined to proceed with the meeting?
Objection. You answer if you have an answer for that.
We would not have declined any meeting based on a safety concern. There's a big difference between a safety concern and a safety culture tie that goes back to an administrative issue.
Did you have any discussion about a Section 15 referral with Mike, Brendan, or Meg at this time?
And object to the extent that it would require you to provide information that would be privileged, but you can answer the question to the extent that it does not.
I do not recall.
Okay. Have you ever had any education with respect to the Air 21 statute?
Not really.
Okay. So when I say reference the term protected activity, do you have any understanding of what that would include?
No, I don't.
When Ms. Petitt communicates, or anyone, well, when Ms. Petitt communicates a issue of non-compliance with safety culture, would you agree with me that that is communicating an issue of non-compliance with SMS?
No, I would not.
Can you explain your answer?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
We have to take full context. If you give me the sound bite, is there a concern with safety culture? That certainly opens up many avenues that we should take a look at. When it's in reference to what she sent to me, it's safety culture as it pertains to an administrative oversight by her direct supervisor. Safety culture refers to what is expected of the corporation as far as embracing a safety atmosphere that leads to safe conduct of the flight. And certainly that was not what her issue was. Her issue was an administrator that she felt was not allowing her to have free reign of her opportunities to go outside Delta.
SMS specifically references safety culture, correct?
Yes, it does.
Okay. And the obligation of a company to maintain a safety culture, correct?
Most assuredly.
Did you, before you met with Ms. Petitt on January 28th, 2016, did you review her personnel file?
I don't recall that I did that, no. I don't think I did.
Between January 28th and March 17th of 2016, did you review her personnel file?
No.
Did you ever order a look back with respect to Ms. Petitt's practices as they related to sick leave and tardiness and other and let me cut the question there, sick leave and tardiness?
No, I don't remember ordering anything like that. I did ask for a look back to take a look at how often she availed herself of the information that was available from the company on operations, on safety. Her report certainly brought forward things that would have lent themselves to her being able to report, and actually a requirement for her to report through both the pub's change process, possibly through the ASAP process. And so I did ask for a review of her her going back to or opening up company information that was sent to her as part of the standard administrative process with every employee at Delta, and specifically pilots.
When did you direct that look back?
I don't recall. It was after she gave us the report. After the 28th.
Was that part of your? Is that part of your Section 15 analysis?
No, actually, it goes to part of the investigation that would have led me to know what to talk to her about with respect to policies and procedures and things that in her report were either not well understood or totally misrepresented. And so I needed to understand what that what her knowledge base was. Was she an engaged employee who would read the things that were being put out by flight operations and by our safety team, or was she getting her information from potentially other sources and maybe not valid or relevant sources?
What conclusion did you reach when you got the results of this look back?
That she had very limited exposure's not the right term, because it's her responsibility to understand all these things that are being put out by flight operations. So I would say very limited drive on her part to open up the information that was being sent to her and to absorb that.
And how did that affect whatever actions you took thereafter?
Well, what it did was it gave me a better understanding of whether or not she was actually an actively engaged employee at the time. So why is that important? Because she brought to the meeting several items that were focused on what her knowledge base was of safety culture, of requirements that had to be accomplished when she was in a training environment, of what Delta's policies and procedures were. And unfortunately, what I found was that she had a very weak knowledge of Delta policies and procedures and the pilot working agreement in general.
Why was it important for you to acquire that knowledge of the practices you just described?
Because I needed to understand whether this was something that was truly a research document that was done with the understanding that this is an issue at Delta, or was this really more focused on issues that happened to First Officer Petitt that had been brought together and put into a single document to present to Captain Dixon and me.
Okay. Did you ever discuss with Ms. Petitt the results of your look back?
I didn't discuss the results of the look back. I asked her specifically, how often have you put in pubs change requests if you're concerned about the different procedures? And she didn't have an answer for me.
Was that before that, at the January 28th meeting you asked her that?
I asked her that. I don't recall if it was. It certainly was at the January 28th meeting, but I asked her that, I believe, again post the 28th meeting, and asked her if she had taken that, taken her recommendations that she brought forward to us and moved them forward with the fleet, and she had not.
And did you, that information that you acquired, considering with respect to the look back, did that lead you to lend less credence to her January 28 report?
Object to the form. I don't think that was a proper question, given the last answer. But
yeah, I think it's important to go back to the way that I broke down the report into the three sections, and what I was trying to establish for my part was, what do we need to do from an educational aspect with First Officer Petitt so that she would understand Delta's policies and procedures more thoroughly, and obviously the other parts, the safety culture part and the accusations of harassment and so forth, those both needed to be handled by other entities at arm's length.
Well, other than the pubs reference you made to her, what other efforts did you make to educate Ms. Petitt about reporting procedures?
Well, it wasn't so much solely about reporting procedures. There were several inconsistencies, and I think I outlined them in the document. I'm happy to pull that document out and reference those if you'd like me to.
Well, I'm talking about the look back, and you engaged in a look back. You reached conclusions about Ms. Petitt and the procedures that she had followed, and I'm asking you, what educational efforts did you engage in with Ms. Petitt as a result of your conclusions?
Well, I asked her if she knew about the pubs change process.
What else?
And I educated her about the ability to use that. And
What else? You mentioned that before. I'm asking what else other than that?
yeah, just we didn't really discuss more than that, because in her in that particular document, that was the one that was most appropriate to the concerns that she had.
Would you agree with me that she raised some serious FAA compliance issues in her January 28 report?
You would have to point those out specifically to me.
Okay, you have no specific recollection.
No.
Okay. Isn't it true that Mr. Dixon asked you to investigate the safety and compliance issues raised by Ms. Petitt in her report?
Well, Captain Dixon and I agreed that I would be the one to investigate everything in the report.
And he asked you to report back to him regarding your findings?
Yes, he did.
And did you report back to him?
Yes, I did.
And how did you report back to him?
I would brief him.
Was this a written brief or an oral brief or a combination?
Oral brief.
And what did you tell him?
I told him how we had broken down the report and how the investigation would be carried out, and then when I would get a report that came in, I would relay it to him.
Did you tell him that Ms. Petitt had not raised FAA compliance issues of significance?
I don't recall that I ever said that to him.
Did you report to them that Ms. Petitt had raised FAA compliance issues of significance?
I don't recall that I said that either.
Would you agree with me that in commercial aviation, a large portion of incidents and accidents are attributable to pilot fatigue?
I would say that fatigue certainly plays a role in incidents and accidents, and it can never be dismissed.
And would you agree with me that under the federal aviation regulations, a pilot who's excessively fatigued has an obligation to remove himself from his assigned flight?
Yes.
Would you agree with me there's a certain tension between preventing pilots from flying while fatigued and maintaining a carrier's schedule?
We never try to prevent a pilot from identifying their fatigue. And there is constant operational pressure. It's an airline. We trust our pilots to be able to handle the difference between being physically qualified and able to conduct the mission safely and having to either slow down or stop the operation in total because they are not fit to fly or they are too fatigued.
Isn't it true that Delta has threatened disciplinary action for pilots who call in who request sick leave to address fatigue issues?
Absolutely not.
Has Delta taken disciplinary actions for what it has characterized as abuse of sick leave?
Repeat the question.
Has Delta ever taken disciplinary action against pilots for what the carrier characterizes as abuse of sick leave?
Yes.
Okay. Now, in your experience at Delta, do pilots sometimes feel pressured to fly while fatigued?
Objection. Do you want to hear that question again and think about whether?
No.
Okay.
Pilots are, by nature, can-do spirits. They want to be able to perform at the top level, and they want to be able to carry out the mission. So is there self-imposed pressure that a pilot puts on himself to be able to complete the mission? Certainly. I've faced that my entire life. I also understand when it's time to say that I'm fatigued and I can't fly the aircraft. So once again, we have pilots that make good decisions, have great judgment, and know when to actually say that they're fatigued. So I trust them to make that call, and we back that call every single time.
What obligations does Delta have under the federal aviation regulations to educate their pilots with respect to fatigue issues?
Well, we have a fatigue risk monitoring system, and part of that fatigue system is to review the fatigue reports that come in. On top of that, we have 3 different software packages that we run our rotation construction through that measures for fatigue. We have a joint fatigue review board and a fatigue risk monitoring team with ALPA that meets monthly and reviews all of our fatigue reports. And we have a sleep scientist who is now on our staff and has been for quite some time, as well as employing sleep scientists, the most effective in the industry, to help us put together our fatigue monitoring program. So I hope I answered your question somewhere in there, but the fact of the matter is that Delta does have a fatigue program. It is in compliance with the FAA requirements to have a fatigue program. And in fact, we work very cooperatively with the FAA and with the Airline Pilots Association.
I don't find the answer to my question in there, so let me ask again, what are the FAA requirements with respect to Delta's operations and fatigue?
Objection to the extent it calls for a legal conclusion. You can answer.
That if a pilot calls in fatigue, that they will be removed from their trip.
And then are there additional requirements? Are there not additional requirements in terms of education and training that the
Yes.
FAA imposes on Delta?
Well, not that the FAA imposes on Delta. You have to submit a program that the FAA approves, and that includes an education process. And Delta has been fully engaged in that education process for a number of years.
Okay, so the FAA does require Delta to develop an education process related to the fatigue issue for pilots, correct?
Yes, they do.
Okay. And then that program is required to be approved by the FAA, correct?
Yes.
And if there are any changes to that to that Delta program, those changes to the Delta program also have to be approved by the FAA, correct?
I don't know that that is a true statement. Modifications to the program can be brought forward at any time based on the information that the company is receiving through whatever reporting you want to talk about, whether it's the Aviation Safety Action Program, the ASAP program, the FOQA program, flight crew reports, a pilot stepping into the chief pilot's office and saying, hey, this rotation didn't work. We make modifications to the fatigue program all the time because we're modifying our rotations all the time. So the bottom line answer is that the FAA sets a very minimum bar for a fatigue program, and Delta always goes above and beyond that in how we execute our program.
What are the education and training components of Delta's FAA-approved fatigue program?
We have policies in our flight operations manual with respect to fatigue, and we train that in our continuing qualification programs.
And are managers in the flight department required to have that training as well?
If they're a pilot, yes.
Okay. Well, do they all have to have training with respect to understanding the issues of fatigue and ensuring that pilots are not pressured to fly fatigue?
Anyone involved in the decision-making process for the operation would be educated in fatigue, yes.
Okay. So your regional directors would be educated with respect to the training and education requirements under the FAA-approved program?
They would be educated to the Delta policies and the flight operations manual. They don't have to recite phrase and verse from the FAA. That's not part of any program we have at Delta. The fact is that we have an approved program, so they need to understand what the Delta program is in the flight operations manual.
Okay. And the same we go with a line check airman, that they would be expected to have knowledge of the FAA-approved Delta fatigue program?
Every pilot at Delta would have knowledge of the Delta fatigue program.
And as part of the FAA-approved Delta fatigue education program, the education of pilots to the effect that they have an obligation to remove themselves from flight assignments when they are fatigued?
Not only to remove themselves, but to identify fatigue in the pilot that they're flying with.
Now, in 2015, you were aware that Ms. Petitt had made public statements to the effect that she had flown in a fatigue state as an airline pilot. Isn't that correct?
Yes, I recall that.
and that she considered that to be part of the job, to fly fatigue, in a fatigue
No.
state.
I'm sorry, I misunderstood. I thought you were referencing her book that she noted that while at a prior airline that she flew in a totally fatigued state and was not crew rested and violated the FARs and conducted that flight anyway.
And did you ever speak to her about that reference in her book?
No, I did not specifically. I did read it, and it was pointed out to me. I read it, and I said, that's not anything that we would ever condone at Delta, and that was one of the reasons that we would not allow her to be able to put her title or Delta Airlines on her book.
Did you ever communicate to her an assurance that at Delta she was not required to fly in a fatigue state?
I'm not sure she ever asked me.
That wasn't my question. My question was, did you ever give her assurance that she was not required to fly in a fatigued state?
I did not proactively tell her she didn't have to, nor have I done that with any of the other 14,000 Delta pilots.
How many of the other 14,000 Delta pilots have identified to you or communicated to you that they felt subject to pressure to fly while in a fatigue state?
Objection? He seems, objection.
I don't wait for pilots to call me and tell me that they felt like they needed to fly in a fatigue state. I proactively communicate to pilots through my base visits, through my letters that go out to the pilots, that safety is always number one, and you should not fly fatigued. You should. It's backed up by ALPA as well. We have a like mindset on that. So this is not a deep, dark secret that the pilots have out there. So not sure what else I can say other than it's ever present, it's backed up in all the communications we put out, and it's very clearly stated in our manuals.
My question is, have you ever had a Delta pilot communicate to you that he or she felt pressured by Delta management to fly in a fatigued state?
I certainly have had pilots who have insinuated that there may be pilot pushing going on, or what was referenced as pilot pushing, not directly from the pilot, but through other sources,
What sources?
through ALPA.
And who at ALPA communicated that to?
That's a great question. I can't remember specific names.
Well, you use the term pilot pushing. What does that mean?
Pilot pushing is a phrase that was essentially designed by ALPA to be used a lot of times in an industrial sense. But the way I take it is that if there was ever a situation where a pilot felt like they were fatigued, that there should be no operational pressure for them to continue. And if they felt that there was operational pressure to continue, that we would back their decision to slow down or stop the operation.
When ALPA made these communications to you concerning pilot pushing and fatigue, did you ever respond with a management investigation of the issue?
Whenever I hear that there has been an inappropriate or a perceived inappropriate request to continue to fly fatigued, we certainly investigate, and we certainly review the circumstances around it.
Okay. If I could, but you can't recall any specific investigation in response to an ALPA communication of concern?
It's not coming to my immediate memory.
Okay. If you could refer to Graham Exhibit 4, which is the assessment of Delta Airlines flight operations safety culture. Now, I'm going to direct your attention to the third paragraph that begins with bold heading, Basic Indoctrination 2010. Said pilot attended a
You have to do
I'm
it.
sorry.
Oh, I'm sorry. Tell me when you're there. I'm looking at
Yeah.
the second page of the document,
Okay.
third paragraph, subtitled Basic Indoctrination 2010. Said pilot attended a basic indoctrination class, and the manager of scheduling told the class the 4 reasons they could deny a trip, one of which was fatigue. However, he also stated, never call in fatigued at Delta. That is the other F word. You recall reading this part of Ms. Petitt's report?
Absolutely.
Okay. And who was the manager who made this statement to her?
I have no idea she didn't have a name for me.
You asked her the name?
I did. I asked her names about every single person in this document.
Okay. Would you agree that for a manager to tell a basic indoctrination class never called in fatigued at Delta, that is the other F word, would be non-compliant with Delta's FA-approved fatigue program?
You're first making the assumption that the quotations are correct and that the
Yes, I am.
wording
That's
is
the
correct.
question.
Please let him finish.
That is the
Let him
question.
finish his answer. Don't interrupt him, sir.
Do you understand the question?
No, but don't argue with him. Let him answer his question. A little respect for the witness, please.
Yeah, I would appreciate that. And the answer is that if in quotations, I would need to understand what is the context of the question that was being brought forward to that supervisor.
Being brought forward.
Mm-hmm.
No.
I can't tell what the context is around this. This is a single quotation taken out of thin air in what would have been probably a 2-hour brief, and I don't have anything that gives me the background on how this was brought forward. All I have is a single statement. And when I went forward and asked to have the presentation reviewed and have someone sit in on the presentation, granted, this is 2010 and we're talking 6 years later. That's a pretty long period of time. So I don't know who might have said this. I don't know if the presentation had changed. What I can tell you is that as they were reviewing this as part of the indoctrination class and the new hire class, this is not part of that. So I would have to recreate this with the person whose name brought it forward, and I would go directly to them and ask, and I was not given that name.
My question is, if a manager in a Delta training class told his class, never call in fatigued at Delta, that is the other F word, would that cause a concern for you that there might be non-compliance with Delta's FAA-approved fatigue program?
Certainly.
Now, would you agree that, okay, so it's your testimony that you asked Ms. Petitt the name of this manager?
Yes.
Okay. And she could not remember or refused? Or what was her response?
I don't recall that she refused. She did not have the name of the person.
And what efforts did you make to track down the name? Why are you laughing?
Because this was 6 years ago, and we have several people that conducted that brief. So at the current time, so my knowledge back in 2010 of what was happening was very, very limited.
Is the answer then that you made no effort to try to identify this person?
No, matter of fact, I think I answered that question before, but I'll be happy to answer it again
Please
for
do.
you.
Please
and let
do.
me
Please
and let me clarify.
And please be respectful of the witness.
That I did contact the new hire coordinator and the indoctrination coordinator, and I said, "What information can you bring me?" And they didn't have any information to bring forward. I said, "Then let me go ahead and have you review and sit through the class and tell me what we're putting out in class to our pilots."
I've handed you a document that we've identified as Graham Exhibit 12 from Jerry Harrod to Steve Dixon, showing CCs to Jim Graham, Ken Highlander, Mike Doyle, and others. So can you tell me whether you received this email thread in November 20th, 2012?
I'll state objection to the use of the document to reserve all rights regarding the use of this document in this case. But the witness can certainly be asked questions during the deposition about it.
I believe I do remember seeing this. It's been a long time.
Is Mr. Bastian involved in the SMS program at Delta?
He is the leader of the SMS program.
Is he on a safety committee?
The head of safety reports directly to Mr. Bastian.
How frequently do you meet with Mr. Bastian with respect to SMS?
I don't.
You don't ever?
No.
Would you agree with me that Mr. Bastian is ultimately responsible for the airline's SMS compliance?
Mr. Bastian is responsible for all safety at the airline.
And part of the SMS program includes examining data gathered from everyday operations?
Yes.
Do you attempt to isolate trends that may be precursors to incidents and accidents and then take steps to mitigate the risk?
Yes, we do.
I want to direct your attention to Exhibit 4, page 4.
I'm sorry, I'm having trouble finding it. Give me a second.
That's the Petitt.
Graham 4?
The Graham 4, right?
Okay. Yeah. Yes, I'm there.
Okay, you're on page 4?
No. Uh, 181 at the bottom?
Correct.
Yes.
I want to direct your attention towards the bottom third, and there's a heading there that starts, that precedes a series of bullet points, and it states, statements from Delta Senior Flight Operations Management indicating essence of Delta culture include, And you see there's a series of bullet points with quotations.
Yes.
Okay, and you see the first statement reads, if there was a better way, Delta would already be doing it. You see that quote?
I do.
What was your understanding as to why Ms. Petitt was bringing this to your attention?
These are all a series of quotes that had no context behind them whatsoever. So she pointed to this as an issue with the Delta culture, and without having background behind how these quotes were said, what context they were made, they didn't hold a tremendous amount of weight with me.
Okay. So you didn't have any understanding that she was bringing this to your attention with respect to Delta's compliance with its SMS obligations?
No, what I understood this to mean was that she wrote down several quotes, and that she assembled these to try to distinguish what she considered to be a culture that she really hadn't experienced at Alaska to compare it with Delta.
Okay. So you did not understand this to be an SMS compliance issue?
No.
Okay. And did you ask her who made these various statements?
I did.
And what did she tell you?
I did not get a response.
Did she refuse to respond, or she did not remember?
I don't recall.
Well, what would you have done if you got a response?
Objection.
Flight operations management should be embracing the safety rules and regulations and fostering open communication with the pilots. And certainly this would drive a discussion with whoever the management person was, whoever the alleged management person was, to understand when this would have been said and how it would have been said. This is, I can't tell where these were said, how they were said. There's really nothing to base anything on.
Okay. And that last bullet point, what was your understanding as you read this when you came to the term retaliatory line check?
Well, first of all, we don't give retaliatory line checks. We never have. And for someone to say multiple retaliatory line checks, I would have to truly understand the context. Because line checks, first of all, are not given to first officers. Typically, they're given to captains.
And did you ask her for the context of that statement?
I feel certain that I did, but I'm not 100% positive.
Did you ask her for the context of the first bullet point statement?
Actually, at this point, I believe that she was telling me that these were statements that she had heard, and
She had heard directly?
well,
Could you please let him finish his answer before you're interrupting him? Were you finished?
no, I was not.
I was just looking for a clarification.
Yeah, I have no idea whether she heard these firsthand, secondhand, thirdhand.
Good.
So, and she never said that these were actually said to me, and this is the context with which they were brought forward, and these are the people that said them.
Did you ever ask her if she had heard these statements firsthand?
What I asked her was, what information can you give me about the context of these? And I expected to get back a response that this is the time and the place and the person, and I didn't receive that back.
And you asked her at the January 28th meeting? You asked for that context?
No, I don't recall that I asked at that particular meeting. As a matter of fact, what we did talk about at that meeting was what flight ops culture was and what the safety culture was, and what we had always tried to bring forward as part of that safety culture. So this actually would have been in a subsequent discussion, and because at that point I had not gone through the document to be able to break it down for investigation.
So sometime after January 28th, you asked her for the context of these statements?
It was either I asked her directly, or I had asked one of her supervisors to talk to her about that. Yes.
Oh, so you may in fact never have asked her for the context of any of these statements.
I certainly did ask her the question, but the fact is had she been asked or given me that information, and if she hadn't given me the information, I may have asked to have it reviewed with her one more time.
All right, I'm confused. On January 28th, you did not ask her for the context of these statements, correct?
What I told her was we would take this entire report back and we would break it down and start an investigation. Yes.
I'm asking specifically with respect to these bullet points. On January 28th, you did not, in fact, ask her about the context of any of those quotations, correct?
To the best of my knowledge, what I asked her is I'm going to understand more about how these were given to you, and I did not receive a response from her at that time.
So you said that much on January 28th?
Yes.
Okay. Did you ever say on January 28th who made these statements?
I don't recall if I did or not.
Okay. Did you ever say on January 28th, were these statements made in your presence?
No, I don't recall whether I specified that or not.
Did you ever say on January 28th who made each of these statements?
I don't recall.
Okay. And then sometime after January 28th, you had a conversation with her about these bullet point statements?
We had several conversations prior to her presentation to the Director of Training, Standards, Safety, and we discussed what she was going to present and take into discussion with that group. And I feel confident that I would have asked about this, although I don't have a specific answer for you that I absolutely can say 100% that I did.
And you say it might have been somebody else who asked her these questions about the context and who made these statements?
Could have been, yes.
And when would that have happened?
In a discussion with her regional director, her chief pilot.
When?
I don't know.
Before or after the Section 15 referral?
I don't know that it would have been, well, it would have been prior to her presentation, which was after the Section 15 referral. So I think I would have to say that the time frame really would have been between January 28th and her presentation to the group.
So if someone else had asked her the context and the speaker for these quotes, would they have communicated to you what the results of what the answers to their questions
If
were?
there was something definitive that came out of it, yes.
So you never got an email communication from anybody concerning these quotes and their further inquiries with Ms. Petitt?
Not to my knowledge.
Now, a line check, if a pilot fails a line check, what happens?
They are, it depends on the type of line check that they fail. If it's a Category B line check versus an unsatisfactory. Category B, you are counseled about things that where you didn't perform appropriately, and you do another check. If it's an unsatisfactory line check, you're removed from the line and you're forwarded to the Flight Operations Review Board process.
Do you know who Ken Watts is?
Yes.
Who is Ken Watts?
He is a captain on, I guess he's on the A330 now. I'm not sure what airplane he's flying now.
Now, he's gave testimony in a recent arbitration hearing in which you participated, correct?
He did. I don't remember what arbitration, and quite honestly, I don't remember what he testified about.
That could have been the Kaplinger arbitration?
Yes, it could have been.
Okay. And he, in fact, testified about having been the victim of retaliatory line checks, correct?
I don't recall that at all.
Okay. Failing a line check could result in a pilot being grounded, correct?
A pilot is removed from flying pending an unsatisfactory line check, pending review and remediation, as dictated by the Flight Operations Review Board. That's the process.
Would you agree with me that failing a line check could be harmful to a pilot's career?
Not looking both ways before you cross a street can be harmful to a pilot's career. So that's a pretty broad question. The answer is, if you fail a line check and you continue to perform poorly, yes, it could be.
Do you have any basis for concluding that Ms. Petitt raised these quoted statements in the bullet points on page 4, bait stamp 181, in bad faith?
I don't think it's intentionally bad faith.
Does Delta have an obligation to train its pilots to a level of proficiency in the aircraft that Delta permits them to operate?
I'm sorry, say that again.
Whether Delta has an obligation to train its pilots to proficiency in the operation of the pilots that Delta authorizes them to operate?
Yes.
Okay. If you could turn to page 5 of Graham Exhibit 4. I'm going to direct your attention to the second bolded subheading. A330 pilots are not confident on the aircraft. Quote, a senior check airman determined that pilots did not hand fly their aircraft because they lacked understanding and confidence, thus were fearful to disengage their automation. A330 check airman, personal communication, February 12th, 2015. Did you ask Ms. Petitt who this senior check airman was?
Yes.
And you asked that of her on January 28th, 2016?
I believe that I did, yes. Actually, I take that back. I did not ask in that venue on January 28th.
On what date did you ask her for the identity of the senior check airman?
I asked for well, no, let me take that back. I don't recall that I asked her for the name of the check airman. What I did ask her for was the circumstances in which the check airman talked to her.
And when did you ask her for that?
And that was sometime prior to her making the presentation to the head of training standards and safety.
And what date was that presentation?
Now you've got me so mixed up on dates, I would have to take a look at my notes, but I'm certain you have that in front of you and you can hand it to me.
I don't, in fact.
Okay.
So you said it was sometime before that presentation, and you asked her what was the context?
Yes. How did this discussion come about?
Okay. But you did not ask her for the identity of the senior check airman, correct?
No.
Did that, reading this quote, did it cause you some concern when you read it?
Not particularly. We had just started into a program to have pilots hand fly the aircraft more. Certainly, we had actually even run some testing to understand how long pilots flew before they hand flew the aircraft before they turned on the autopilot. We had received information via FOQA that that had identified that flying skills certainly had turned more to automation management than hand flying skills. This was not something that was new. So were we already attacking the issue and were we already going after it? It wasn't a Delta specific issue. As a matter of fact, it had been brought up in LOSA observations prior to, and we were right in line with other airlines, actually better than other airlines as we were compared in the LOSA results and by the SIS information. So it's this is not new by any stretch of the imagination, and the fact is that we were working hard at that point to continue to build the confidence level, and we were actually advocating hand flying the aircraft at that point.
First of all, what's LOSA?
LOSA is a line-oriented safety audit, and it's conducted by the LOSA Collaborative out of Austin, Texas. And they are a group that goes around the world and does audits for airlines of all shapes and sizes. And they put observers in conjunction with the company. They set up observers to ride on our aircraft. We traditionally do a LOSA evaluation every 4 years. And as a matter of fact, we just finished one up in June.
Now, it was the lack of experience with hand flying then perceived to be an industry problem in the airline industry?
I wouldn't say a lack of experience hand flying. That's not appropriate. It would be a lack of desire to hand fly the airplane that leads to a lack of confidence hand flying the airplane. What we found was that there was a move towards a mindset that the quicker I can get the autopilot on, the better off I'm going to be. And in fact, in some cases, pilots were using the autopilot to rescue a bad hand flying situation. It was not unique to the 330. And in fact, the 330 did have one of the shorter time frames that pilots would hand fly the aircraft, but it wasn't the shortest that we had.
Would you agree that Ms. Petitt was raising here an issue related to the adequacy of pilot training?
To me, she was making a statement that was derived from a single quote from a senior check airman.
So you did not perceive this as an act by Ms. Petitt of raising a proficiency issue, a pilot proficiency issue.
I looked at it as as something that she tried to carve out as A330 specific, based off of a single input from someone she called a senior check airman that was not substantiated with other facts. And what I did was I went into our training department and into our standards and safety group and asked for the information to come forward on what we were doing about the hand flying. I didn't have to ask them. I already knew what the answer was to all that because I'd been kept in close contact with the issues that were most prevalent at the time, and hand flying the aircraft and confidence hand flying the aircraft compared to turning on the automation was something that we needed to work on.
Did you reach the conclusion that Ms. Petitt had presented you this quote from a senior check airman in bad faith?
No, I just viewed it as what it was, a single data point.
A single data point related to what?
Objection asked and answered.
I can go through it one more time, but a single data point that pointed directly to the A330 and and what she deemed to be her experience on the A330.
Now, the next paragraph, you could draw your attention or direct your attention to the subtitle that reads, "Lack of information sharing." Quote, "The author said pilot continually receives questions from other line pilots as to how to operate the aircraft, procedural questions, line questions, etc. Why don't these pilots know, and better yet, why is there not a formal system with processes in place to answer these questions?" You see that reference?
Yes.
Would you agree with me that here Ms. Petitt is raising concerns about the adequacy of Delta's pilot training?
This actually goes directly back to one of my reasons for trying to ascertain what her involvement was with the information available from the fleet teams. And when she talks about a formal system with processes in place to answer these questions, we actually did have that in place. We had not only the fleet page and an ability to send requests directly into the fleet captain and the flying check pilot. We also had a newsletter that went out from both the fleet captain and from the chief line check pilot. So when I look at this, what I see is someone that really doesn't understand the avenues available within flight operations, and that the context around how she receives the questions was not able to be expounded on.
Okay. Could you read back the question?
Would you agree with me here that Ms. Petitt is raising concerns about the adequacy of Delta's pilot training?
My question really goes, sir, to whether Ms. Petitt was expressing a concern here that pilots were not adequately trained when she references the fact that she receives questions from line pilots as to how to operate the aircraft, procedural questions, line questions. Would you agree with me that she's raising concerns about the adequacy of pilot training?
No, I would not.
Okay. Now, there are a series of bullet points. Did you read through each one of these bullet points?
Will I or did I?
No. Did you on January 28th?
Not on January 28th.
So you didn't ask Ms. Petitt any questions about these bullet points?
No.
After January 28th, did you ask her questions about these bullet points?
I don't recall.
Did you assign to somebody else the responsibility of asking Ms. Petitt about these bullet points?
No, I assigned the task of reviewing whether lack of information sharing was a factor. As you can see up above, she's talking about informed culture, and her statement is employees are knowledgeable about the system and their aircraft. So as that pertains to their knowledge about the system and the aircraft, did we actually have a lack of information sharing? And that's what was brought forward.
Okay. Did you ever conduct any form of investigation as to whether any of the incidents listed in these 5 bullet points actually occurred?
Pilots ask questions all the time. These didn't particularly stand out to me to be something that would be overly concerning, because pilots ask questions about what's going on with their airplane all the time.
Okay. Let me ask. Did you conduct any investigation as to whether any of these incidents actually occurred?
No.
Now, I'm going to refer you to the first bullet point, which reads at 300 feet, ILS 16L, thrust went to idle at 16 capital L. And I'm reading from page 182 of document Graham Exhibit 4. And I apologize, I'll slow down. and I'll start over. At 300 feet ILS space, 16L, thrust went to idle at 300 feet, A/S 7K, below ref, REF period, engaged toga momentarily, landed in TD zone, but with full aft stick to achieve normal TD attitude, and we didn't know why and lucked out. Any idea? What is ILS?
Instrument landing system.
And is that for instrument conditions?
It can be for either. There's a requirement at Delta to always select up a appropriate navigational guidance, whether you're VFR, if it exists.
Is 300 feet a critical altitude for an approach?
Objection. The answer.
Every altitude's critical for an approach.
What are Delta's requirements with respect to speed and power at 300 feet on arrival?
Objection.
The term you are looking for is a stabilized approach. That means on speed, on glide slope.
I'm sorry, I didn't hear the last.
On speed, on glide slope.
Okay, can you explain the reference AS 7K below ref?
Objection. Objection. Are you asking the witness to you're asking the witness to
I'm asking
interpret something that your client wrote? I don't understand why we're asking this witness this. He didn't write this. Your client wrote this. It's badgering.
Are you directing him to not answer?
We'll see how far you go. But if you badger him with questions just to keep him here longer, which I believe you've done, then we will direct him not to answer.
No, these are the same questions.
Because Mr. Graham has a lot of very important responsibilities, as you know. So it's important that the questions relate to the case that we have here, and not just to take up his time. So that's my statement.
Okay. And my statement is.
So we'll see how far it goes.
Okay. My statement is that you're violating Rule 30.
My statement is I am not violating Rule 30,
okay.
and that you don't understand Rule 30, Mr. CM. So we'll see if you want to raise something with the judge about whether or not my behavior here or in any of the depositions has been improper, then you have the right to do that, and I'll be happy to allow that to happen. I hope you don't do that because I think it's a waste of everybody's time. But you're certainly entitled to do that.
Can you explain the reference AS 7K below ref?
Objection. You can answer if you know.
Best guess is that it's
Objection. He told you not to guess at the beginning of this deposition.
Okay. So you don't know?
I don't.
So you wouldn't know whether the operation described is outside of Delta's mandated requirements to continue the approach?
I don't have any knowledge around how this was even described. Was the autopilot on? Was the autopilot off? What were the weather conditions? What were the modes that they were in? I don't fly the Airbus. I'm assuming that this was the Airbus.
So you don't know what a pilot is required to do on an Airbus at 300 feet if their airspeed is 7 knots below ref?
Objection.
Seven knots below ref does not necessarily indicate an unstabilized approach. However, if you are if you see a trend that continues to take you to an unstabilized condition, then you should go around.
What is TOGA, T-O-G-A?
It's actually takeoff go around, which is, I'm assuming that on the Airbus, that's what it is on the Boeing, and that engages go around power. And you don't engage that momentarily on the Boeing. So I'm not exactly sure what that means, toga momentarily on the Airbus.
Well, if a pilot selects toga at 300 feet, should they be expected to go around?
Objection.
That's not what this says. This says engage toga momentarily.
No, I'm not asking what it says. I'm saying if a pilot selects toga at 300 feet, should that pilot be expected to go around?
Objection.
I don't think it's the pilot it should be expected to go around. The pilot engages toga and makes the decision to go around.
The pilot states, quote, landed in TD zone with full aft stick to achieve normal TD attitude. Now, this indicates that the pilot did not execute a missed approach per requirements. Isn't that correct?
It appears that way, yes.
Is that a source of concern for you?
Well, first of all, he's saying that he landed, if TD means touchdown zone, then he was in compliance with the requirement to land within the touchdown zone. When he says full aft stick to achieve normal touchdown attitude, there certainly would be a question as to why did he have to do that?
Okay, well, the pilot concludes, quote, we didn't know why and luck out. Any idea? Would you agree that that conveys a lack of knowledge of operations that's a source of concern?
Objection.
What it raises a question in my mind about is why didn't they talk about it afterwards?
Now, you did not investigate this incident in the first bullet point, correct?
Objection. Asked and answered.
No, I didn't.
Did you reach a conclusion that Ms. Petitt had raised the issue in the first bullet point in bad faith?
Objection. Asked and answered.
What I took each one of these bullets to represent was that she was pointing to not whether or not these were situations that should not have happened. She was pointing to the fact that she felt that she was the one that was being asked this question and no one else. So the question still stood for my team, and that is, what options do we have for pilots to be able to go and get this information? And as I said before, the options are numerous, and what we needed to do was make sure that we weren't shutting down any avenues unnecessarily or inadvertently, and we were not.
Okay, the next bullet point states on T/O got hooked up to AS in 30-degree right bank when accelerating at 3,500 feet. Thrust lock observed, alpha floor suspected but not observed. Hook may have just been on one side, open paren, PNF captain, close paren, period. Not sure what happened. TO means takeoff, correct?
Objection.
On the Boeing, it does.
And takeoffs and landings are generally considered the most vulnerable part of flight operation, correct?
No, not necessarily.
Okay, and what is A/S?
Objection.
I'm not sure.
Does the hookup described here present an operational concern?
Objection.
I can't tell whether this is saying hooked up the autopilot or reached up and tried to engage it and it didn't engage. I'm not sure what they're saying here.
Well, would you agree that the reference to hook up to AS meant the aircraft was going too slow?
Objection.
I don't know what that AS means.
Do you know what alpha floor references?
Objection.
I know that basically what Alpha Floor is on the Airbus as compared to the Boeing, yes.
Okay, could define for me what that means.
Objection?
I don't know the specifics of Alpha Floor. There is a likeness to a minimum speed, which would be a stall speed, but like I said, I don't have the exact definition for Alpha Floor in the Airbus.
Do you know what the reference to thrust lock observed
No.
means? No. Would you agree with me that this bullet point reference conveys a sense of lack of operational control on the part of the reporting pilot?
I would say that this pilot had something happen that he probably wasn't expecting, and as soon as that happens, we expect open lines of communication in the cockpit for the other pilot to recognize what the issue is, and that's what crew resource management is all about. It's also about flight path management, and that's, as you may or may not know, that has been a focus of ours for several years. So this is certainly a situation that we would have expected that conversation to happen between the pilots. When he says not sure what happened, that's the open door to reach out and find out what happened, if the two of the pilots didn't understand it themselves.
Skipping over one bullet point to the second to last one, which reads, I've got an Airbus question for you. This came up on an SID out of AMS, and I'm not sure if the autopilot was just being sloppy or not. The situation is, ellipsis. What is SID?
Objection?
SID, the way that we use it is standard instrument departure.
Okay, what is the functionality of that SID?
It's a procedure to be flown departing an airport.
And AMS would be Amsterdam?
I'm assuming
Objection.
that may be true, yes.
How does Amsterdam ATC react if pilots don't adhere to following the SID?
Objection?
Air traffic control doesn't matter if you're in Amsterdam or anywhere. If you're not adhering to the departure routing, then they certainly are going to bring it to your attention very shortly.
And what does that? What does it mean to say an autopilot's being sloppy?
I don't know. There's not enough context here to understand.
And you made no effort to obtain additional context, correct?
Objection?
I'll withdraw the question. Did you reach a conclusion that Ms. Petitt was reporting this second to last bullet point in bad faith?
No?
No. The last bullet point on the page reads, during OE the wheels fell off. When on my first leg, Albane told me to go vertical speed on the descent into DTW. I was high and fast, and that just made it worse. WTF. What is an OE?
Objection?
Operating experience. It's after the pilot finishes their simulator training and before they're signed off to operate without being under the supervision of a line check pilot. We call it operating experience, and there's an FAA requirement for a certain number of hours in landings to be qualified.
And are OEs typically conducted on live revenue flights?
Yes.
So more likely than not there were passengers on board this reference flight, correct?
Objection. Call.
I'm sorry, Counselor.
Could I hear the question again? I'm sorry.
I'll withdraw the question because it's just taking too long. What does it mean the wheels fell off?
I don't know.
In your work years at Delta, you've never heard that as an expression?
Well, it can be referenced to many things. If you're referencing high and fast, I'm not sure that that's a reference to inappropriately flying the aircraft or whether air traffic control held them high and fast. That is, that could be many different things. So I'm assuming he said things were not going as planned.
Okay. And DTW, that's a reference to Detroit, correct?
Objection.
It certainly could be.
Okay. Is Detroit one of Delta's hubs?
Yes.
And what does it mean to go vertical speed on descent?
On the Boeing, it means you reach up and engage the vertical speed button. It opens up the vertical speed window and you set your rate of descent.
When a descent is high and fast, that creates a potential for overshooting the runway, correct?
Not necessarily. You can be high and fast for any part of the arrival or approach.
Now, you've never flown the A330?
I have not.
And what planes, what aircraft are you currently qualified to fly?
The Boeing 757 and 767.
Are there altitude protections and vertical speed on that aircraft?
Altitude protections, if that not that are designed into the vertical speed, you use the altitude window that designates what your altitude restriction would be.
Okay. So a high fast using vertical speed could lead to an unstable approach, correct?
Yes.
And it could result in the pilot flying through the assigned altitude, correct?
Flying through the assigned altitude. If you're high and fast, not flying through the assigned altitude, you might not make the assigned altitude.
Who is Tom? Tom Albane? That's the Czech airman that we discussed previously.
I'm assuming I don't know from this.
Okay. You never asked Tom Albane about this incident?
First of all, there's no context around this that gives me anything other than that there was operating experience and being conducted on the flight, and if in fact Albane was the line check pilot, then he felt like he needed to give direction to the person that was flying the aircraft in order to try to help them get back on speed because they were not making corrections appropriate to what he felt would be needed to be on a standard profile and in a position to make a stabilized approach.
My question was, did you ever talk to Tom Albane about this incident?
No.
Okay, thank you. Now, pursuant to what document does Mr. Albane perform his duties?
What document?
Yes.
Flight Operations Manual.
And a flight operations manual, that has to be, that's approved by the FAA, correct?
Correct.
And Delta has an obligation under the Federal Aviation Regulations to comply with its FOM, correct?
Yes.
And would you agree with me that the acronym WTF commonly means what the fuck?
Objection. Seriously.
Oh, do you want to, we can stipulate to that. You want to stipulate to that? So avoid, I use.
I'm badgering you, the witness, with that question.
Okay.
What point?
Okay.
What point does that have in this
I understand
case?
your objective. Would you agree with me that that's the common understanding of WTF? Is
Are
what
you
the
asking
fuck?
whether his understanding? That's a question you could ask him, although it's still irrelevant, but.
Do you understand the question?
I've seen it used, yes.
And you understand it to mean what the fuck?
I understand it to be questioning what was the situation. It's a colloquialism a lot of times used by pilots.
Did you ever reach the conclusion that Ms. Petitt had raised this issue in bad faith?
Trying to define WTF? No.
No, the full last bullet point concerning this approach into DTW with Mr. Albee.
Did I think she brought that forward in bad faith? Is that the question?
Yes, that is the question.
No.
This is a good time for a break.
That's fine, yeah.
We're off the record at 3:15 p.m.